This conference will now be recorded.
So start now? Yes. Great. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming to Tuesday Night Talks. Today's talk is about connecting across ecoregions. And to start with, we're going to wonder just a little bit about, gotta get the mouse over here. What is an ecoregion? So we've got a video. This is Leia, and she's pondering to herself about borders. We're at the Arizona border. We just left Utah. What are you gonna miss the most about Utah?
You know, I really love Utah, but standing here on this border, it feels very arbitrary because it all looks the same as it did before. And Utah, no geological differences.
So as Leia points out, Arizona, Utah, at that border, it all looks the same. Borders are man-made. And so an ecoregion is defined by areas of land or water that have like a similar ecosystem and natural communities. And so if we think about that in our region, our ecoregion, we have more in common with, say, like some areas of Canada than the North Slope. We may be in the same state. We have more similarities with this other country. And so, we talk about connecting with ecoregions. So why do we want to connect? And as we know, we are facing kind of an ecological crisis in many regions of our ecosystem. And so when we think of these crises, a lot of them are marked by these ideas that we are different or separate from other people. We see this in politics. We see this with the coronavirus and people feeling like other people weren't looking out for them. We might see them in the ecosystem when we think about resources and how we distribute resources. And we see other people as competition for our resources. But if we want to have a more sustainable future, we need to start thinking about how we can connect with other people. So that's kind of the basis of why we're focusing on connecting within ecoregions. So we all live in this area with shared resources. How can we connect and work together? So a little background. This picture was taken in October of 2017. This was after work, going for a walk in Whittier, Alaska. I then left Alaska in 2018 to go pursue a graduate fellowship in teaching in Colorado. So exactly 1 year later, went from beautiful wet Whittier with my raincoat and hat to October 2018 in the desert. And when I got to the desert, everything was vastly different and very, very dry. It was brown. There was very little green. My skin was dry, my nose was dry, everything was dry. And I started to realize that it wasn't just my region in Colorado that was dry. The more I was listening to the radio, and they were talking about how everything was dry, and the newspaper was talking about how everything was dry, because Colorado is in the middle of one of the worst mega droughts that we've seen. And it started in 2000, and it's still going. And headlines all over are saying how the Colorado River is shrinking because of climate change, and we have to give up water for farms. And this is where I lived in Eagle River, and even at the top of the watershed, they were saying how they have to cut their water. And it just kept going. And even now, I think it's reached Alaska. We have started seeing these headlines in the newspaper and on the radio. It's kind of big news. And I was from Alaska, where we don't have to worry about water. I'd never thought about that before. And so I started wondering, how can we have gotten into such a predicament? So the Colorado River watershed stretches through Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, Arizona, parts of New Mexico, Nevada, California, and Mexico. So we've got all these states and 2 countries. And when you're trying to negotiate a resource among 2 countries, it can be really tricky. And all those states. And so in 1944, the Colorado River Compact was drawn up. And that was dividing up all the water and saying how much each state was able to take. And when they divided it up, they had no idea that they were in the middle of a 100-year flood. So they thought they had 17.5 million acre feet to divide up amongst all these states. Well, the actual natural flow rate, the average, is really 16.3 million acre feet. So they assigned more water than they actually have. Now, to add to that, we've got this massive drought. So between 2000 and 2020, the average was 13.4 million acre feet. So remember, people think they can take 17 million acre feet, but there's only 13 available. And during the drought, the demand has averaged about 15 million acre feet. You might wonder, how can we be using more water than we have? And that's where the reservoirs come in. We've got Lake Mead, you've got Lake Powell, and so we've had backup water supplies, but those are slowly being drained. Over the course of the drought, they have used, I think that it was 32 million acre feet more than, 32 million acre feet is the deficit that they have drawn, which is a lot. And so I started to read more books about it. We've got all kinds of books. We've got Running Dry by John Waterman, which is, he follows the Colorado River from source to sea in his boat. The Exploration of the Colorado River and its Canyons is the seminal work on the Colorado River by John Wesley Powell. Monkey Wrench Gang is a fiction book, but focuses on the Colorado River. Cadillac Desert addresses how we divided up our water. Where the Water Goes is similar to Running Dry. Emerald Mile, great book about a man who rafted the river when they did what was called a pulse flow, where they released a lot of water from the reservoirs. And as I'm reading these books, I started to realize that they have a lot in common. In addition to all being written by men, they all sort of have this possessiveness over the resource. And it all comes back to this quote by Mark Twain. So even before the drought, people have been fighting over water, and they say whiskey is for drinking and water is for fighting. And I was like, ooh, do we want to fight over a resource? What happens to those who aren't equipped to fight? And so I was in grad school for education, and I'm trying to figure out how can we teach kids to care about the land and care about each other and live more sustainably. And if perspective taking is important for having sustainable behaviors, but we're being fed these narratives that we have to fight for our water and it's every man for himself and no one values the water the same way that you do, then how are these kids going to think about their relationship with water? How are they going to think about the people who are living downstream from them? If you think that you have to fight for your water and the people downstream don't use it as well as you do or don't appreciate it as much as you do, then are you going to be using sustainable behaviors or are you going to be trying to take all that you can? And so that, I just feel like narratives really matter. And that narrative that we have about the Colorado River can do more harm than good. And there's 40 million people living in the Colorado River water basin. And I started to wonder, well, what other stories are out there? We have the narratives from our conservationists who are saying that this is an endangered river. We must protect this river. And the people in the West and the lower basin, they don't value it as much as we do. They waste the water. They use it for crops. And then we have the farmers out there who are saying, we provide 90% of your winter vegetables for the entire country. And you can't just shut off our water or we're all going to starve. So we've got these two voices that are constantly battling each other, but who's not being heard? And can we change that narrative? Instead of us versus them, can we figure out a way that we are all connected and a way that we can collaborate for a sustainable future? Enter the water cycle. So the water cycle was a woman-led 2,000-mile bike ride. It was meant to engage all the voices of the Colorado River, and we used science education and storytelling. We were funded by National Geographic. I think I signed a contract that says every time I say this, I have to say they gave us money. And the water cycle was made up of 6 women of various backgrounds, 2 with Cordova ties. This is Rebecca Hagmuller. She grew up here. We've got a teacher, a park ranger, a teacher, an artist, a teacher. So our mission was really focused on the children. And we thought, okay, so if we want to start building connections among children, how do we go about doing that? And so we had 3 steps. The first one was to explore a sense of place. Figure out, where do you live in the watershed and what about it do you value? Next, see the place in context. So we live in this tiny little region that's part of a bigger region. How do these interact? And then the third step is to share their experiences with the larger world and the other people who live in the watershed. So for exploring a sense of place, we had all kinds of activities we did with the children. They would make their own watersheds out of tinfoil, and then we would spray them with water so they could see how landscape influences the way where water goes. We found our locations on a map. Some lucky kids who had more time, we were able to take a hike with them. We walked from their school, following a stream to the confluence where their local stream or river then tied into the Colorado River. And then putting the place in context. So once they had an idea of their own place, we made a living map to see where they are, what's upstream of them, what's downstream of them. And all of our students, they all had a different role within the watershed, and they used their bodies to act out their role. And so after they were able to see all the different spots along the watershed, they saw the very top. We talked about the Rocky Mountains, how it flowed through the farmlands of Colorado, how the water was used for the ski resorts to make snow. Then it went into Utah. We talked about how it carves through the rock, and we have the rafting in Moab, and then it goes through the Grand Canyon, all the way down to Yuma, where it feeds all of our winter vegetables, and into Mexico. And so we would, after they knew that, we gave them postcards from upstream, and they had to figure out where on the map they are and where their postcards came from. And these are kids in Mesa Rica, Mexico. at the very end of the watershed. Now for our older students, we had an activity that was meant to help them start thinking about perspectives. Every student was, or groups of students were given a piece of paper that had a river drawn through it, and they were allowed to develop their river however they wanted. They could put farms, cabins, amusement parks, shopping malls, and they just designed it and they created their town. And then we surprised them by putting them all together and making one big river. And then we would tell them a story about how everything along the river interacted with each other. So this one up here, they had a pig farm. Well, the next thing you know, that all that manure from the pigs washed into the stream, which then washed into a river, and then the river carried the manure down into this next area. And how did that impact those people's settlements?
We can think about this. So what are some things that we could change or different in areas to maybe have a better
And so this is a 10-minute video. And at the very end, the students, one of them says, after they've been arguing, one of them says, wait a minute, isn't this the point of the activity? Because they realize how hard it is to manage a shared resource. And when Leia, that's our instructor right there, when Leia asked them, what could we do differently? They all just started pointing fingers and saying, well, they need to get rid of their sand, and their farm is the problem, their zoo is the problem. And so by doing that, the kids were able to start thinking about how their actions might affect people downstream, and maybe how to communicate more effectively about their needs with communities upstream. And then our last section was to share a story. So the kids all wrote postcards that would go to a community downstream. And they wrote about what they loved about the Colorado River, or what the Colorado River meant to them, and how they were going to do something to help people downstream. They're very cute. And then they put them in this mailbox that was attached to the front of my bicycle, and we pedaled them downstream. So in addition to teaching, we were also being taught, because, well, we came from Colorado. We did not necessarily know what life was going to be like in Utah or Arizona, Nevada, Mexico. And so in addition to teaching kids, we also learned something that we were not expecting. And so we started up here in the Rocky Mountains. We've got this nice rippling stream. We've got plenty of greenery, big mountains. This is Poudre Pass in Rocky Mountain National Park. And from there, we rode into the desert. There's Moab. Here we've got the Colorado River on our right. Through Bryce Canyon. And you can see it's getting redder and drier to where there's no vegetation at all. We went through the Grand Canyon, over the top, not the bottom. There's no bike trails down there. Through Yuma, which grows 90% of our winter vegetables, all the way to the Colorado River Delta. Molly, what are you seeing?
Maybe at one point, when this was still a big floodplain, this area was covered with water.
So that right there is the Delta. It is completely dry. Normally it would be a floodplain similar to our Copper River Delta, and you'd be able to ride boats out there, but instead we drove because there's no water. And it was pretty sobering to just see like vast tracts of land that you knew used to be green, or at least semi-green, and now there's no water. The water hasn't reached Mexico for about 20 years. Or I should say, it hasn't reached the ocean. A little bit of water still comes into Mexico, what they're promised in the Colorado River Compact. By the time it gets to Mexico, it is so salty from all the agricultural runoff that it's virtually unusable. They still do try to use it though for agriculture, but it no longer reaches the Sea of Cortez. And so what we learned, we rode our bikes through 2 countries, 5 states. It was over 2,000 miles, and we met over 2,800 children. And what did we learn? Well, one of the things that we were not expecting was that we learned that it doesn't matter where you are in the watershed, everybody does have a sense of personal responsibility. There's that narrative that other people don't care as much as you. Well, that narrative was wrong, because people downstream, they knew what it was like to live in an arid region. They were very aware that they did not have access to water the same way that people upstream did. And they were taking action. They were doing a lot more water conservation than we saw upstream. Upstream, it was just sort of like a vague fear, like one day we're going to run out of water. But downstream at all the campgrounds, they'd have like 7-second showers. You had to constantly push the button to take a shower. And there's signs everywhere that said, we haul our water, please conserve. So that idea that people downstream aren't conserving water and that's only the rafters and the conservationists upstream, totally false. And then we learned that we often think of downstream as being victims to the actions of people upstream, whether that might be the Mississippi River, the Copper River, the Colorado River. We just think that if you're downstream, you're getting the short end of the straw and you're a victim. But when we started to think about it, we were like, well, wait a minute. Instead of seeing downstream as a victim, what can they teach us upstream residents about how to live more sustainably? Because what they are living through right now is going to be the future for Colorado. And at the very end of our trip, we went to Laguna Grande, which is a restoration site on the Colorado River Delta. And it's run by the Sonoran Institute. And the woman who runs it, Gabriela, she told us that her big mission when she has children come to her interpretive center is she tries to tell kids that everybody is responsible for their own destiny. A lot of the narratives in Mexico is that the U.S. is taking our water. The U.S. is taking our water. The U.S. doesn't care about us. And her goal is to show the students that if we take responsibility for our own destiny and we have control over our own actions, we can do something with our own agency. The Sonoran Institute was granted 0.01% of Mexico's water. And you saw that flat delta that we were on with completely dry. Well, with that 0.01%, they have done this restoration site. So this is 60 kilometers away. So that stick, she was saying, when they first got there and they started replanting the trees were about that big. Oh. So it's kind of hard to hear, but what she's saying is they started out with these little twigs that were their saplings, and now they have these giant cottonwoods, because it's amazing what you can do when you put something where it's supposed to be and you give it the resources that it needs. And they only had less than 0.1% of Mexico's water. She's like, what happens if we get 1% of Mexico's share? What could we do for the Delta? What if we get 5% of Mexico's share of the water? What could we do for the Delta? And then our other takeaway was that our relationships to the land are very human-based. You know, again, that argument, that narrative that we're always hearing is very much based on conservation versus the economy. But what really mattered to the children were human relationships. So when we looked at all of our postcards, we read through them, 78% of our postcards to kids downstream were referencing human relationships. I love rafting with my dad. I love fishing with my dad. I love hanging out with my friends. 82% of them mentioned recreation. Well, they love swimming. They love fishing. They love sitting by the water and reflecting. And only 7% of them referenced the economy. All of those were the kids in Yuma. Yuma's cultural identity is very much based in farming, and the students were very proud that they provide the whole nation with all of their winter vegetables. And so there's 40 million people in the watershed, and we only got to meet 2,800 children. It's really just a drop in the bucket. But when the kids started thinking about other kids, you could see that it really started to elicit empathy. So dear kid, to the kid reading this, I hope you have access to clean, healthy water. Stay cool in this hot summer. Granted, it was fall. But and so by tapping into our human connections, by thinking about how we relate to the land, how other people relate to the land, and how we have similar goals and needs, maybe we can have a sustainable future and manage our resources wisely. Those are all the people who gave us money and that we must thank.
Yay, Kate. You want to take any questions for you now, or do you want to wait till the end?
We can wait till the end.
Okay. Think about your questions for Kate. All right. So now we're going to talk about the Copper River Stewardship Program, which is not nearly as intense as what Kate described, cycling 2,000 miles. I thought it was intense until I heard about the water cycle, but instead it's a 10 to 12 day stewardship adventure throughout the Copper River watershed. So just like Kate mentioned, that we're trying to build connections between people that live in different locations within the ecoregion. This is exactly what we're trying to do on the Copper River Stewardship Program. I think most of you in here are very familiar with this program, if not have participated in it yourself or a family member. But it takes a lot of partners to pull this 10-day adventure off. The Science Center and the Copper River Watershed Project are our local Cordova nonprofit partners, and the U.S. Forest Service is our local government partner. And then we have upriver partners. So WISE, Wrangell Institute for Science and Environment, is our upriver nonprofit partner. And then we have 2 government partners upriver, the BLM and the National Park Service. So 6 agencies work together to get these stewards out and learning about and building connections throughout the watershed every summer. We typically take 10 stewards. Students, they're high school aged, and they have to either live in the watershed or have a very strong connection to the watershed. So that could be grew up here and moved away, or has a family member that lives here and they spend their summers here, or they spend some time up here in the watershed. So just like Kate was mentioning, we have this link, this immediate connection between ourselves and everybody that lives within the watershed. So the students that join the stewardship program are linked by the Copper River, though the entire point of the Copper River Watershed Project is not just to talk about the Copper River the entire time, because unlike in juxtaposition of the water cycle, the Copper River isn't lacking for water, but there are other shared resources that we have, and we use those resources extremely differently depending on where we live in the watershed. And because Kate and I are educators, I'm going to put you guys on the spot. We're going to have some participation in this Tuesday night talk. What are some resources that the lower portion of the watershed shares with the upper portion of the watershed? Fish. Thanks, Pete. Gold star. What else? Water, definitely.
Some migratory birds.
Birds. Yep. All right. If it isn't resources, what are things that we might have similarities with being in such different locations?
Yep.
Okay. And I felt some feeling in that word, Pete. I felt some emotion behind that word. And it is certainly not unknown by these high school students that there is a difference in the way that we work with salmon. A lot of the Cordova kids especially are from fishing families. You know, there is a Cordovan identity that we are a fishing town, and they wear that proudly on their chests and on their sleeves. And they have maybe preconceived notions or preconceptions and narratives about how upriver is using the resource, whether it be dip net, recreation, or fish wheel. And a lot of our students from the upper portion of the watershed are part of families that have fish wheels, part of families that go dip netting, or are part of families that run guided trips in the upper portion of the watershed. So we're bringing those narratives together, sticking them in vans and sailboats, and making them spend a lot of time together talking about how they have similarities and differences. It's not always salmon related though. While that is the main connection that brings us together, we spend a lot of time, and every year actually has a different theme. So each year's trip might have a different theme. This one was movement. So we talked about the movement of silt, the movement of birds, the movement of people, and the movement of plankton in Prince William Sound. We have talked about trout. We here in Cordova are at the upper extent of the coastal cutthroat trout, and the Copper Basin is at the upper extent of rainbow trout. I see a lot of fish and game biologists in the room, so just give me like, yeah, you're talking right. Cool. We also we study plants in our different regions, and we do a lot of different stewardship projects while we're on the stewardship program. Another thing we talk a lot about and we work on is students advocating for themselves and advocating for their region. And one of the ways we practice that is the students get the opportunity after their trip, after they spend their summer learning, to present what they've learned at Alaska Forum on the Environment, which is a huge conference in Anchorage. And the students go, they make presentations, and they present to adults and peers while they're there. So I pulled 3 slides from a presentation they gave in 2019. And this presentation is from the movement trip, when movement was our theme. And this is how they decided to break down our communities: precipitation, tree types, and community feelings, because here we are again, feelings are so important. So Copper Basin didn't rain, 70 to 80 degrees, this was in June. And then I think the entire time we were in Cordova on that trip, it was either drizzling or raining, and it was cloudy and cold. Same, like 3-day window. All we did was take the sailboat from Valdez to Cordova, and we were in a totally different location in their mind, not just based on the weather, but also on our trees. It is a huge shock when kids from Cordova are in the Copper Basin, and a huge shock when Copper Basin students are down here in Cordova at just our tree types and our vegetation abundance. So we have the boreal forest that Cordova students called thin and leafy, and the temperate rainforest here that the Copper Basin students said had huge trees and many other types of life. They also picked up on community feelings, even though it wasn't something we necessarily talked about. What the Cordova students called the Copper Basin temperate and humidity difference in environment feels spread out, which is very different from Cordova. And that there's a happy vibe. Remember, we're dealing with teenagers. And that Cordova has environmental differences. It feels small, but it's fun. So they're experiencing not only are the environmental differences and learning about the different regions through like scientific exploration, but also meeting with experts in the field and learning how those experts might interact with their environment differently. And they are hearing and learning from each other about their experiences in the community. We often have students from Cordova, when we're here, give their own tours of their own boats, so that students from the Copper Basin are learning from their peers what it might be like to spend a summer working on a fishing vessel. Where when we're in the Copper Basin, we might visit a steward's farm and learn what it's like. It's really interesting to see these teenage brains like comprehend that we're really not that far away, but man, we live really different lifestyles. And a big part of the stewardship program is shared learning activities, team building, the spider web of trust, nature journaling, so expressing our what we're learning either through art or media or the written word, and of course, having a lot of fun while we're doing all of this. And just some of the takeaways from the trips that we go on. Students are not required but encouraged to complete final projects, and they can get high school credit if they do so. So it can be giving a Tuesday night talk about their trip. It can be creating a photo book. There are some out in the lobby. From past experiences, it could be a watercolor. This was obviously a salmon-themed trip. They can write local newspaper articles, do art installations, maybe write children's books if they're excited about it. But all the while we're going along, they're journaling. And so these are 2 that I pulled out of their journals. Dear future self. So this was writing a letter to your future self and what you would want to look back on and think about your trip or be reminded about the lessons you were learning. Living in the Copper River watershed is a unique experience that very few people are fortunate enough to have. My family has the opportunity to live in this breathtaking place and make income using the many resources. A majorly critical part of our lives is the river. And I'll end on the one at the top. Quite apart from the scheduled learning, I've also experienced camping, rafting, and simply meeting and talking to people my age. Everyone else here already knew a lot of these things, but it was all new to me. And with that, thank you for listening. We'll take any questions. And I want to, before that, put in a little plug that Kate made a movie about the water cycle, and we will be showing that on April 21st during a film festival. So there are 9 films that we're showing at the Cordova Center on April 21st, and that is a fundraiser for our Women in Science Scholarship, which supports our campers.
It's going to be a little less academic and a lot more biking.
And skiing
and
mountain biking.
Edgy. Cool vibes.
Yeah, vibes. All right. Does anybody have any questions?
So you have a figure in your presentation, I think 40 million people in Colorado watershed. And I'm just curious, like, is that including the communities, cities that use that water that are actually outside of the watershed that's being pumped?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Okay.
they say that it's 40 million people is the drinking water for 40 million people.
Yeah, so I know that includes LA, San Diego, Denver, Fort Collins, Boulder, Fort Collins, and Colorado Springs.
Yep. They pull it right over the mountain.
I spent the last 7 winters up in Colorado, so I got to see a lot of that stuff, a lot of the diversion projects, and it's just kind of mind-boggling. And that's not even counting any of the stuff in the Lower River, you know, the All-American Canal, for instance. The thing that goes to supply Las Vegas.
Or the Central Arizona Project,
Right? Yeah.
which for those who
It's such a huge scale.
aren't familiar, it's just like a trough almost, I guess, that ditch that's running water, and sometimes it's, for a lot of it it's covered, but sometimes some parts of it aren't even covered, and you're just like, evaporation? This is a desert? You're gonna ship water hundreds of miles in an open pipe?
And that goes to what you mentioned earlier about it. That would be a real good deal.
I recommend that one more than any of the other ones. Well, besides the Monkey Wrench Gang, I love the Monkey Wrench Gang. But that one I felt was like a really unbiased source. The whole trip was actually started when I read John Waterman's Running Dry. Because have you read that one? He rafted from source to sea, and the way that he wrote about downriver communities was so disparaging in some parts. There was one part that I'll never forget where he is in southern Arizona and he like gets a sandwich at a shop and he asks them, what is there to see around here? And he writes like, he handed me the American cheese on white bread and said, nothing to see here. And then you turn the page and then he just like lists all of the birds he saw. And I'm like, okay, you're making a statement about this person without really getting to know this person. And it hurt my heart a little bit. And that's why I was like, I want to talk to that sandwich maker.
Did you find him?
I did not. But all those books are excellent books. Would recommend all of them. Even John Waterman's.
I just wanted to mention that Lauren, both my kids have done the stewardship program. It's beautiful.
We've got
See that still happening.
We've got an alum here too. So yeah, I think this is the 14th or 15th year for the stewardship program. Yeah. And yeah, it's wonderful. It's a great opportunity for every student that's involved. And I think, not to have an emotional moment, but reading back through their journals, you can see a lot of them like really making connections and really deciding, what they want to do or what they might be interested in pursuing as high school students. Like, oh, I never knew you could have a job working with migratory birds, or I never knew you could have a job working with salmon. I thought they were just a resource. And so, yeah, not only does it provide connections between the students throughout the watershed, but throughout opportunities within our watershed as well.
I think every river needs a Copper River watershed project. Stewardship
And a watershed project.
and a watershed project. I wonder, how could the Colorado River be different? As far as I know, there is not an upper basin, lower basin exchange.
Yeah.
They will raft different parts of the river, and there's lots of youth programs, but I've yet to read about any that bring all the children together in one room. It's a really special thing we have here.
Yeah. Well, thank you for coming to hear about it. Hope you have a nice night.